What would happen if your business ran out of water? Take a minute to think about this. Could your company continue to operate? Most businesses depend upon water for at least part of their operations, and in many cases, water is a crucial input to the products or services that the company is providing. Without water, the company would need to cease its operations entirely. Water is one of the most precious resources on the planet, if not the most precious resource. We need water to live, and virtually all businesses need water to function. But we typically assume that water will be there when we need it. Unfortunately, that may not always be the case in the future. In January 2018, Cape Town, South Africa announced that it would run out of water in just 3 months. April 12, 2018 became known as Day Zero, the day that Cape Town would no longer be able to furnish water to people's taps. Cape Town relied for its water supply on a system of large local reservoirs that caught yearly precipitation. Unfortunately, Cape Town was suffering from an extraordinary 3-year drought that it had never seen before and never expected to see. As a result, its reservoirs were virtually dry and unable to supply water to its 4 million residents. Cape Town hoped to maintain water to its central business district when Day Zero hit and avoid the total breakdown of its economy. But the city expected that it would need to turn off all water to its residents. As of Day Zero, if people needed water, they would have to go to one of 200 water centers that the city intended to create around the Cape, where they would be able to fill their buckets with just 25 liters of water per person, only enough for a 3-minute shower. Businesses, however, were not totally spared. Businesses outside the central business district could still be impacted. In order to save water and avoid Day Zero, moreover, Cape Town drastically reduced the amount of water that agricultural operations in the Cape region received. And farmers voluntarily gave up additional water in order to try to avoid Day Zero and its most serious consequences. Dramatic conservation measures by agriculture and other water users, along with the 11th hour rain, saved Cape Town from Day Zero. Even without running out of water, however, the economic impact on Cape Town was still enormous. Cape Town lost over $400 million in business revenues, primarily from lost agricultural operations. It suffered a 13% to 20% decline in exports, and it lost 30,000 jobs, thankfully most on a temporary basis. Imagine what the loss would have been if Cape Town had actually experienced Day Zero. Cape Town, unfortunately, is not unique. Although few regions expect to totally run out of water, more and more areas of the world are facing significant reductions in local water supplies. Farmers in the Central Valley of California are facing dramatic reductions of water as a result of various regulatory measures. A long-term drought has significantly reduced the amount of water available in the Colorado River system, which is the lifeblood of the Southwest United States. Starting next year, both Arizona and Nevada are likely to face lower water deliveries from the river. A number of factors are conspiring to increase water risks to businesses in many parts of the United States and the world. The first factor is climate change. Cape Town never expected to see the type of severe 3-year drought that it experienced in the lead-up to Day Zero. Scientists had estimated that such a drought would occur at most only once every 300 years, a possibility that Cape Town believed it could safely ignore. As a result of climate change, however, the chances of the drought were actually once a century, 3 times more likely than it had historically been. Scientists now estimate that if temperatures increase around the world by 2 degrees Celsius, and most scientists believe that that's all but certain, the probability of such a catastrophic drought in the Cape Town region will triple once again to 3 times every century. Scientists are not sure exactly how climate change will affect precipitation and thus water availability in any specific region of the world. Growing populations and economies are a second factor that will lead to greater water risks in the future. Here again, Cape Town provides a useful morality tale. Cape Town's populations had almost doubled since 1985, and its agricultural economy had significantly expanded. Yet water supplies had increased by only a paltry 15%. Cape Town, in short, had expanded dramatically, but had not ensured that its water supply needed to meet that growth also expanded. Populations and economies, however, continue to grow. The world's population is currently growing slightly more than 1% a year. This may sound like only a small percentage, but it is a huge number. We are adding almost 100 million people per year to the globe, and population will likely peak before the end of the century at 10.9 billion people compared to today's 7.7. Much of the growth, moreover, is expected in those regions of the world already suffering from the greatest water scarcity. World gross domestic product is expanding even faster than population, at a percent annual rate at the moment of approximately 3%. The water needed to support this growth will further add to water pressure. A third factor leading to increased water risk is the unsustainability of many of our current water practices. Take the growing global challenge of groundwater. Many regions of the world are highly reliant upon groundwater, to the extent that they are actually taking more water out of the ground than is being naturally replenished. This is known as overdrafting, and it can have severe consequences. As groundwater tables drop, wells often go dry. To the degree that groundwater is still available, water users need to pump the groundwater greater distances to the surface, increasing the cost and energy needed to pump groundwater. The land surface can also subside, causing major damage to overlying infrastructure and increasing flood risks. The photograph next to me is a graphic illustration of groundwater overdrafting. It is a photograph of a U.S. Geological Service employee standing in the middle of California's Central Valley, an area that has suffered significant groundwater overdrafting. The telephone pole next to which the employee is standing shows the surface of the planet in both 1925, that's the top sign on the pole, and 1955, the middle sign. As you can see, the land subsidence caused by groundwater overdrafting in this portion of the Central Valley has been dramatic. Laws in the United States and elsewhere increasingly demand cutbacks in water use in order to ensure that both groundwater aquifers and surface waterways are sustainable and healthy. Historically, the law in most jurisdictions treated groundwater largely as a commons. Groundwater users could pump groundwater to their heart's content with few restrictions on total overlying use. That is why so many regions currently suffer from the groundwater overdrafting that I described earlier. To avoid groundwater overdrafting, however, many governments in the United States and elsewhere have passed laws that require reductions in groundwater use. During California's most recent drought, for example, the California legislature passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, or SGMA for short. Under SGMA, local governments in California must develop sustainable groundwater management plans that balance the water availability with water extractions no later than 2040. If local governments fail to successfully ensure groundwater sustainability, the California State Water Resources Control Board can step in and impose a state groundwater management plan on the local region. These local and, where necessary, state sustainable groundwater management plans will require dramatic reductions in groundwater pumping in many areas of the state. The Public Policy Institute of California estimates that California's Central Valley will ultimately need to fallow anywhere from 500,000 to 750,000 acres of prime farmland in order to bring groundwater withdrawals into balance, reducing agricultural profits by somewhere between $1.3 to $2.1 billion and leading to the loss of 13,000 to 21,000 agricultural jobs. Water scarcity is not the only problem posing increased water risks to businesses and other water users throughout the world. Another source of risk is the increased focus of policymakers on the human right to water. Historically, few countries recognize an explicit human right to water. South Africa actually became the first country to formally recognize a human right to water when it revised its constitution in the 1990s after the end of apartheid. Several other countries now recognize a human right to water, either in their constitutions or through judicial decisions. And in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly explicitly recognized a human right to water. The vote was 122 countries in favor of recognizing a human right to water, and none opposed. Interestingly, the United States and 40 other countries, including Canada and Australia, abstained. California became the first state in the U.S. to recognize a human right to water through legislation passed in 2012. That statute provides that every Californian has a right, quote, to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. Although the human right to water in California is not enforceable in court, it has had a major impact on California state water policy and on the way in which people discuss and think about water. The human right to water can have a major impact on businesses that extract large amounts of water in a region. Where the extractions appear to be disproportionately large to the amount of water available to local domestic users or small farmers, for example, concerns can arise that the business is taking water from the region to the detriment of local citizens, and thus in violation of the human right to water. Even if the concerns do not lead to legal action, they can pose a major public relations concern for the business. All of these various factors together are increasing business risks to water in many regions of the United States and the world. Earlier this year, CBP, a nonprofit that promotes corporate environmental disclosures, surveyed 800 large publicly listed companies regarding water risks. 75% of the companies reported that they are currently exposed to serious water risks, up from 70% in 2015. The major risk that businesses reported was inadequate water supplies, although companies reported a wide range of risks, including risks to social reputation. Companies, moreover, reported that they had already suffered almost $40 billion in water-related financial losses in 2018. The survey, however, also suggested that many companies were not sufficiently attuned to these risks, nor were they necessarily taking action to overcome them. Fully half of the companies reported, for example, that they had actually increased their water withdrawals over the prior year. Water risks, in short, are real, and they are increasing over time. What should your company do in response to these risks? You should consider taking at least 3 steps. First, you should evaluate what water risks your company currently faces, and then design effective actions to address those risks. In some cases, the risk will be the possibility of physical water shortages. In other cases, the risk will be social or political in nature. Coca-Cola provides an illustration of both the risks that companies face and how companies can effectively address them. In 2000, an Indian subsidiary of Coca-Cola opened a new bottling plant in Pachamama, a rural community in the Indian state of Kerala. Soon after the plant opened, local residents found that some of their wells were drying up and that water levels were falling in others. Residents blamed these groundwater impacts on Coca-Cola's withdrawals from the local aquifer. Local residents also found that their groundwater was contaminated with high levels of cadmium and lead, which they again blamed on the Coca-Cola plant. In April 2002, residents began to protest against the local Coca-Cola plant, claiming that Coca-Cola was putting local farms out of operation and demanding that the Indian government take action. As a result, the Coca-Cola plant closed in 2004, and Coca-Cola found its social license to operate in India under threat. For Coca-Cola, those protests over its Indian operations were a wake-up call. Water is a major ingredient of Coca-Cola products, and the company's ability to continue to obtain needed water on a sustainable and socially acceptable basis is crucial. As a result, Coca-Cola decided to embark on a company-wide sustainability program. Coca-Cola pledged to replenish 100% of the water used in its products, either by returning the water to the environment or to local communities, and to do this by 2020. Coca-Cola met this goal 5 years early in 2015 as a result of over 4,000 replenishment projects throughout the world, including 60 projects in the United States. Coca-Cola also took steps to reduce the amount of water that it uses in many of its global operations. Since 2005, it has reduced its water use by 12%, and Coca-Cola now has set a goal of reducing its water use 25% from 2010 levels by 2020. Through these and other projects, Coca-Cola has become a standard bearer in the area of water sustainability. Coca-Cola, in short, has turned a potential liability into a beneficial corporate showcase. If your company has not already taken steps to address the sustainability of your water supply, the first action you should consider is preparing a water footprint for your company that would show the total amount of water that your company is currently using, the geographic distribution of its water use, and trends in the water use over time. This will permit you to get a rough sense of what your overall water use is, to identify where major water risks might exist in your company, and to benchmark yourself against competitors. You should also examine the water risks posed in your supply chain. Even companies that do not face direct water risks may still face the risk that suppliers will be delayed in filling orders, or maybe even unable to fill the orders at all because of droughts or other water shortages. According to the CDP survey that I mentioned earlier, approximately half of the companies surveyed have already engaged with their supply chains to evaluate and address water risks posed to the company from supply operations. The next step after identifying risks is to examine opportunities to address those risks. Some companies may seek to conserve water. Other companies may look for additional water sources in order to diversify away from the current water risks. In some cases, for example, companies may be able to purchase their own water rights so that they are no longer entirely reliant on local public supplies. Yet other companies may look at opportunities for recycling or reusing water in their current operations. A variety of nonprofits and engineering firms have developed evaluation tools that can be used to analyze water risks and to develop effective solutions. The World Wildlife Fund, for example, has developed what it calls a water risk filter to identify and address the greatest risks that a business faces. The water risk filter provides a variety of maps and reports that companies can use to evaluate the types and locations of water risks that they currently face. The water risk filter also allows companies to assess the water risks associated with particular geographical sites, using maps with 32 different data layers that are updated annually. This tool also provides a questionnaire that can be used to evaluate site-based operational risks and recommend actions that companies can take to address these water risks. The World Wildlife Fund is now developing a new tool that will permit companies to convert those water risks into potential economic impacts. The World Wildlife Fund's water risk filter is only one of a number of tools now available. The Global Environmental Management Initiative, as well as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, have also developed their own global water tools for evaluating business water risks. Most engineering and consulting firms also offer their own proprietary tools. The CDP survey offers a window into the degree to which major businesses around the world are now taking advantage of these types of tools to address their water risks. According to the survey, 60% of companies now regularly monitor and manage their water supplies. Approximately the same percentage have conducted comprehensive risk assessments of the nature that I just described. And about a third of the companies have gone even further and set water targets and goals. After identifying and addressing any water risks that your business confronts, the second step is to look to see whether you can convert potential water liabilities into water opportunities. As water becomes scarcer, it also becomes more valuable, providing companies with the potential opportunity to generate profit. The key is to look at water not as an input or a liability, but as an asset. Consider again day zero. The Marriott Corporation owns several properties in the Cape Town area. One is a Westin hotel immediately next to the coast. For years, that hotel has faced a flooding problem from the nearby ocean. Water from the ocean floods the garage and the basement of that hotel, requiring the company to spend significant sums pumping the ocean water out. In the face of day zero, however, the Westin Hotel saw that what it had long viewed as a liability was now a potential asset. The Marriott Corporation installed a small desalination plant in the basement of the hotel, which is now used to desalinate hundreds of gallons of water per day. The Westin Hotel uses some of this water in its own operations, and then it sells the remainder of the water to neighboring hotels to also need a reliable source of water for their operations. Rather than paying to get rid of the flood water, Marriott has now found a valuable business opportunity. Finally, your company should consider whether it wishes to invest in the water sector. Even if your company does not have a source of water that it can turn into an asset, your company may still find water to be an interesting area in which there are attractive new business opportunities. Private companies are playing an increasingly important role in the management of water resources. Engineering companies, for example, are developing new technologies needed to increase water conservation, desalinate water at an affordable price, or recycle water to drinking water quality standards. Consulting firms are helping water suppliers and users to manage their water more efficiently. IT companies are helping to supply the data that water suppliers and users need in order to understand their water systems and manage them better. Water suppliers are also making increased use of artificial intelligence to help identify and resolve problems before they would otherwise manifest themselves. Financing needed water infrastructure is a major opportunity for investment firms that might be interested in becoming involved in the water field. Water is an area in which infrastructure investment has lagged dramatically over the last half century. As a result, the Environmental Protection Agency estimates that water suppliers will need to invest almost $500 billion over the next 20 years to maintain and improve their infrastructure. Over $300 million alone of this will be needed to replace and restore aging or deteriorating pipelines. Almost $100 million will be needed to rehabilitate and expand drinking water treatment facilities. Another $50 billion will be needed for new storage reservoirs. Private financing will be critical in closing this gap. Like many cities in the United States, the town of Bayonne, New Jersey, chronically underinvested in water and sewage infrastructure during the 20th century. Many of the water pipes that it used dated back to the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. In 2012, the investment company of Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, or KKR, partnered with a subsidiary of Suez, a major international water company, to take over Bayonne's water supply system, update its infrastructure, and provide clean, safe drinking water to its population. KKR agreed to pay $150 million to the city for the rights to a 40-year concession on its water system, and to provide an additional $157 million over the life of its contract to manage and upgrade the water system. In return, it received the revenues from the water supply operation. In a similar deal, KKR and Suez in 2015 also acquired a long-term concession for the water system of Middletown, Pennsylvania. KKR in that case paid $43 million for the concession and agreed to invest another $83 million in the water system over the life of the contract. These concession contracts provided needed infrastructure financing and water management know-how to Bayonne and Middletown. They also proved to be successful investments for KKR. In 2017, KKR sold its share of the concessions to Arco Infrastructure Partners. KKR's gross internal rate of return on its Bayonne investment was 36%, while its gross internal rate of return on the Middletown investment was 61%. Although rates of return on such water investments can be large, risks are also significant here. In order to run water systems profitably and to ensure adequate reinvestment in infrastructure, concessionaires, for example, often must raise water rates, leading sometimes to significant local opposition. In order to protect against unexpected problems, state and local governments are also increasingly insisting on detailed new processes designed to ensure adequate public input and avoid unexpected problems. Legal guidance is therefore critical from the outset for any companies considering such investments, but the opportunity for profit is significant. In many areas of the world, water is increasingly scarce. The world, in short, is drying. This poses a risk to all businesses, a risk that needs to be evaluated and then addressed. But it also presents significant opportunities for those businesses willing to carefully study the field. A risk, however, that we haven't discussed yet is the short memory that most people have of near disasters from water shortages. Water users, not surprisingly, often focus on water risks during droughts or other water shortages that threaten business operations and the lives of local citizens. But once those droughts end, water risks are frequently quickly forgotten. People return to their belief that water will always flow from their taps. When Cape Town, South Africa was anticipating day zero, it announced ambitious plans to diversify its water supply and avoid future water shortages. It announced that it would build new water desalination plants and recycling facilities. It would expand its reservoir system. It would begin to tap neighboring groundwater. While Cape Town began working on many of these projects in the day leading up to day zero, work has slowed down since Cape Town announced that it no longer faces day zero. Businesses throughout the world cannot take the risk that they will face a day zero of their own without being prepared. More and more companies are assessing their water needs and uses and taking action to eliminate those risks. And they are wisely doing that even if they are not faced with an imminent catastrophic risk. A significant number of these companies, moreover, are now looking at how they can turn water from a risk into a business opportunity.
Picture this. During the holiday season in Manhattan, You stroll into the high-end fashion stores on Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue. And then, as part of your shopping experience, you walk into a store that looks a bit like an Apple store, with attentive salespeople and high-end wood decor and luxury products that include lotions, chocolates, and other candies, teas, candles, and other fancy items, treats for the holidays that promise stress relief and other mood-boosting benefits. Where are you shopping? A place called MedMen on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the most dominant cannabis company in the legal marijuana industry. So if you still think the marijuana industry is about smoking pot, about stoners and slackers and bongs, you're behind the curve and potentially missing out on a huge opportunity. On the other hand, if you lose sight of where today's industry came from and you rush in to invest in this market of seemingly endless opportunity, you're going to make critical mistakes. So we're here to talk about the fear of the industry and the fear of missing out in the industry, because you need some of both to conduct the right level of due diligence. So I'll begin by giving you a picture of the legal landscape, where we are across the states and at the federal level in terms of cannabis legalization, what you're allowed to do and where, and what we all expect to happen in terms of the next states to act. We'll also look at what the drivers are in legalization, because we have to know what forces are at work to best predict what will happen next. After that, we'll take a look at the formal risks and the realistic risks of investing in cannabis companies. While we're optimistic about where things are headed, we still have to make you aware of the harsher, scarier risks if we faced a federal crackdown on cannabis. But the good news is that the formal risks are not necessarily realistic risks. So we'll talk about the realistic risks based on recent law enforcement activity. Then we'll assume that you understand the overall legal landscape and when to proceed. Where and how do you begin? I'll take you through the nuts and bolts of due diligence, what to ask and when to walk away. Right now, we're seeing the transformation of a black market cannabis industry into a regulated, lucrative global industry. Cannabis is the fastest growing industry in the US, expected to generate over $20 billion by 2020. Right now, 11 states, California, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Colorado, Nevada, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, Michigan, and Illinois are now fully legal in the sense that they legalized not only medical marijuana, but the recreational use of marijuana, or adult use as well. 32 more states allow the medicinal use of marijuana. Those states vary in what conditions they allow for: epilepsy and cancer, Parkinson's, anxiety, insomnia, severe pain conditions, and post-traumatic stress disorder. A handful of other states allow only sales of CBD. Depending on where you live, you might have noticed that more and more pharmacies post advertisements that CBD is available there. In hip coffee shops, you might see CBD-infused coffees and other products as well. What is CBD? Cannabidiol, an extract from the marijuana plant that is reported to have medicinal value but has no THC. And it's the THC in marijuana that is psychoactive, that makes a person feel high. CBD lacks that, so CBD-infused products and the CBD oil itself are now marketed as wellness products. And once you start to look for it, you'll see that CBD is a trending wellness product. Those who chased after other superfoods, turmeric, matcha green tea, are now chasing after CBD. So what are the significant state developments here? The biggest developments in adult use legalization have been Michigan and Illinois, the first Midwestern states to legalize. And most exciting in the next up category are New York and New Jersey. Last spring, New York was poised to become the largest state, apart from California, to legalize, but then stopped short, only got through decriminalization last term. But the New York governor has made legalizing marijuana one of his top legislative priorities. And this is surprising because less than 2 years ago, Governor Cuomo was still referring to marijuana as a gateway drug. And this shift in perspective is not unusual. We're seeing the same shift in many politicians. We're facing a rapid and sweeping change in public opinion. In 2020, we could see the legal regimes for adult use in the 3 largest cities in the United States: New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Be aware, though, that just because a state votes to legalize doesn't mean the product can be purchased in the near future. There's typically a year or more of lag time between legislation and open for business. So what happens in between? A state commission is established along with a licensing and regulatory framework. The state determines the number of licensees it will allow and how those licenses will be obtained. Then the licensees build out and prepare to open. In Massachusetts, this process took over 2 years. In Maine, which also legalized marijuana, no adult use licenses have yet been approved, which is driving some people across state lines to Massachusetts instead. And in Illinois, where the new industry is set to go live on January 1st, 2020, no regulations for the industry have yet been released. So where are we at the federal level? While still illegal, December 2018 brought us a big development, the 2018 Farm Bill. What did that do? Industrial hemp became legal, and CBD produced from industrial hemp became legal. Here's the wrinkle, though. CBD can be produced from either industrial hemp or from the marijuana plant. If it's produced from the marijuana plant, CBD remains illegal. It remains listed on the Controlled Substances Act. That means that the DEA has the power to prosecute its distribution. But if it's produced from industrial hemp, the DEA can no longer touch it. Note also that the Farm Bill doesn't preempt any state law. So if, in fact, there's a state that bans industrial hemp, then hemp and hemp-derived CBD remain illegal in that state. All of that said, this is a huge step forward. So what's driving the momentum for legalization? A few forces are at work. Certainly, some savvy PR firms attempting to change the image of the person who uses marijuana from the stoner image to the productive citizen and person who lives next door. Also, older people, those over 55, are the largest growing demographic of marijuana users. They are the ones, after all, most likely to be afflicted with the medical conditions for which marijuana could be helpful. And surprise, most don't want to be taking a handful of pills every day and want to explore alternatives. Another is that more and more people view criminalization of marijuana as harmful to society. Felony convictions ruin lives. Incarceration costs are exorbitant for locking up people for possessing and selling marijuana. And for what? For a product most now view as far less dangerous, far less harmful, and far less addictive than alcohol. Safer than alcohol is a refrain we're hearing a lot from legalization advocates. So now, just above 2/3, or 66% of Americans support legalizing marijuana for adult use, and this is inching upward each year. In the year 2000, only about 31% favored legalization. It's also the case that now we have well above 90% support for legalizing marijuana for medicinal use. But before we get too excited about where things are headed, let's pause and remind ourselves about the risks. Yes, federal enforcement activity has slowed way down as to marijuana, but it does happen. And so here's the bad news part of the presentation. Marijuana remains a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. There's a lawsuit in New York right now challenging this classification, but it's unlikely to succeed. And as long as selling marijuana is formally treated like selling any other narcotic, it's illegal to receive, reinvest, or spend proceeds from a marijuana business. So if you proceed, you have 3 major criminal risks to consider. First, aiding and abetting a drug trafficking organization. A medical marijuana grower, even a state legal one, is technically in violation of federal law. And to the extent that you're providing goods or services to assist that grower, you might be aiding and abetting federal criminal activity. Second, if you are transacting in proceeds of a marijuana grower, you need to be aware of the risk of money laundering charges. And third, if you're providing financing, equipment, or real estate to a marijuana business, you need to be aware of the risk of federal seizure and forfeiture. So why do people take the risk? Well, many people have taken comfort from two sources of federal guidance. A DOJ memo referred to as the Cole Memo that outlined law enforcement priorities, and a guidance memo from FinCEN, which is part of the Department of Treasury. The Cole Memo said, in essence, that law enforcement will look at the most significant threats, those to public safety and public health. Law enforcement was therefore stating its intent to prioritize the prosecution of marijuana sales across state lines to minors, or those sales connected with gang activity, or that's being used as a cover for illegal activity, or had some other feature that would invite law enforcement attention. The FinCEN memo provided guidance to financial institutions looking to bank marijuana proceeds and encouraged robust due diligence on the state compliance of the business. FinCEN also required institutions to file what's called a Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR, when a marijuana account was opened, and listed a number of red flags institutions should be attuned to if they take on marijuana businesses as customers. Those SARs filed by institutions allow the Department of Treasury to track the number of banks with marijuana customers, and that number has risen steadily over the past several years. Then in 2018, the Cole Memo was rescinded by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and lawyers predicted that the sky was falling and a federal crackdown on marijuana was coming. But what happened, in fact, was that everyone held their breath for a few months, and then, if anything, the market was actually buoyed by a backlash against the rescission of the Cole Memo. Individual U.S. attorneys' offices announced that they would continue to act on the same law enforcement priorities. The FinCEN guidance remained in place. Then, most recently, in Attorney General Barr's confirmation hearings, he said he would not go after state legal marijuana businesses. He said he did not want to disrupt the expectations and parties' reliance on the Cole Memo, and that if a business followed state law, it would not have to worry about federal law enforcement. Then in April 2019, Barr actually said he was accepting the Cole Memo. So that all sounds promising. But there continue to be federal law enforcement raids on marijuana businesses. There are pockets of activity, mostly and perhaps surprisingly, in states where adult use marijuana is fully legal: Colorado, Oregon, and California. Why? The answer is pretty simple. Federal agents and prosecutors aren't disregarding the Cole Memo, they are abiding by it. They are going after businesses that are acting as covers for illegal activity. For instance, last fall, the U.S. Attorney in Colorado announced that he would prioritize state-licensed businesses that were acting as covers for illegal grows. But importantly, what are we not seeing? We're not seeing federal law enforcement activity directed at state legal businesses. And I don't expect that we will see a return to that activity again, period. So that's all good news. But this type of piecemeal legalization allows black market activity to continue to flourish. Why? Because the price differentials are huge. And what that means is that for those investing in or partnering with or providing services to a cannabis business, you have to stay alert to the fact that licensed operators can be tempted to act beyond the scope of their license. When that happens, there can be criminal exposure as well as swift action by regulators against the license. Now let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of due diligence. To begin, what are the products and services you're interested in? The market is broad and growing, so you need to pick your market sector. Do you want to interact with a business that touches the plant directly, a grower, a dispensary, or a processor? Or do you want to interact with a business that supports such a business, or one that's ancillary to the marijuana business? Those are the three big categories: touching the plant, direct support, and ancillary. Even within touching the plant businesses, there are several different market sectors, and the market sector will drive the due diligence. For example, within the touching the plant category, you have biotechnology, cultivation, retail, hemp and CBD products, and marijuana products. Biotech includes pharmaceutical companies that are focused on cannabinoids and medicinal products. Cultivation and retail includes growers and dispensaries. The hemp CBD sector is just what it sounds like and is quickly becoming associated with the health and wellness market more than the traditional marijuana market. And the marijuana products market consists of those companies developing food, drinks, oils, extracts, and lotions containing cannabis. The direct support category includes ag tech, real estate, and secondary services to marijuana business. This would include everything from companies providing equipment, technology, and supplies to grow and produce cannabis, such as greenhouses, farming products and fertilization systems, air filtration systems, real estate companies, and professional service firms that provide packaging, physical security, lab testing, and compliance consulting. The third category is broadly described as the ancillary company category, and this would include companies that make consumption devices like vaping devices, companies in the investing and finance sector, tech and media companies such as those that provide seed-to-sale tracking, online delivery service companies, e-commerce and product review platforms, and other ancillary companies that don't fit neatly into an existing sector. The due diligence will also vary depending on whether you are looking to invest in a cannabis business or simply bank the proceeds. As a general rule, and one that you might expect, the more direct involvement you have with the marijuana plant or a form of the plant to be ingested, the more involved the due diligence will be. You will have not only the unique diligence surrounding cannabis, but also safety and marketing concerns. So let's take a hypothetical and then work through the diligence. Let's say you want to look into acquiring a state legal medical cannabis grower. You'll first want to know the regulations of the state where it's based thoroughly, of course, and look for 4 areas of competence in the grower. You want to look for competence in the areas of finances, compliance, marketing, and operations. So let's start with the basic financial competence you would be assessing. Within this area, the diligence will look similar to what it would look like in any other industry. So we'll move through this area pretty quickly and give you broad categories of information to collect. You'll want to review all of the basic corporate documents. Those would include charter documents, meeting minutes, organizational charts, bios of all senior managers, and a description of the operations of each business unit. You will also want to review the financials, including the audited financials, income statements, financial projections, and supporting information, budgets and business plans, stockholder agreements, stock purchase agreements, audit reports, and order information. You'll look at tax returns and summaries of tax issues facing the company, real estate information such as the leases, deeds, and environmental assessments of the property. Finally, within this topic, you'll look at insurance policies and a list of all material intellectual property. But again, that's all standard corporate due diligence, looking at assets, liabilities, business plan, costs, and revenue. But now let's talk about what's unique to cannabis company due diligence. The compliance competence assessment. You'll hear it repeated by a lot of consultants for cannabis companies that if you're in the business of cannabis, you're in the business of compliance. There has to be a culture of compliance demonstrated at the company. Lack of compliance gets you shut down, period. So don't make the mistake of thinking that compliance with state law is just a minor regulatory issue. The state cannabis regulators can be very aggressive, in part because they feel a great responsibility to show that they can keep their house in order and police compliance and rid the industry of bad actors. They also fear that if they fail to demonstrate zealous enforcement, the feds will come in and spook the whole industry. I've had plenty of conversations with state regulators where they make that very clear. And so it's important to understand that they can be quick to pounce on compliance infractions. So how do you assess the company's culture of compliance? Not just by looking at the compliance officer, but by looking at all of the employees, because the employees are running things day to day. And in the cannabis industry, you can have some special personalities. The types of employees working in a cannabis company are changing quickly, but they can be a uniquely challenging group because a lot may have a past in the black market, or at least in the gray market. There was a preference among new cultivators for a while to select a head grower with a decade or more of experience. Well, you can imagine if you want someone with a decade or more of experience, you're going to have a hard time finding someone with a decade or more of purely legal experience who is accustomed to taking compliance issues seriously. Now we have some sensationalized media portrayals of the grower culture coming from places like the Netflix documentary series Murder Mountain, which chronicles events among marijuana growers in Northern California's Humboldt County. But you definitely need to think carefully about any grow employee from what I'll call outlaw culture or with an outlaw mentality. It's extremely difficult to bring an employee who operated or worked in an outlaw grow into a regime that is so highly regulated. And if you have just one employee like that, he or she can create a lot of tension with the other employees. And then you have a situation where you have a diva grower against more compliance-minded but less knowledgeable employees. And that's a recipe for disaster. Any regulatory investigation is potentially devastating for at least two reasons. First, there's always the concern that the investigation will lead into areas that invite federal scrutiny. There's an aspect of don't ask, don't tell in these new state regimes. New licensees in the state have to get started somehow. Their seeds or plants need to come in from somewhere out of state, and that's always an awkward situation. So there's always the risk that findings are made by the state that end up triggering a more serious federal investigation. Second, if you are a grower, you are a single product company with a perishable product that is sitting on the shelf indefinitely. An investigation can therefore be financially devastating. So how should you vet the employees? Look at the employee training materials provided, the employee screening procedures, the turnover employees, absentee history, and the write-ups on key employees, especially the head grower. Are there disciplinary write-ups? Are there compliance write-ups on the key employees? And if so, how did the employees respond? How does the compliance officer get along with key employees? How does he or she feel about the level of respect for the position? Is the compliance officer given the authority she needs? Is her feedback welcomed or resented? Again, if the company ends up getting investigated, the compliance officer's role will be very carefully evaluated to determine whether any issues were systemic or isolated. Ask the compliance officer about her familiarity with investigations and enforcement actions against other growers in her state or in other states, and then assess whether they might have similar weaknesses. Another recurring issue in investigations and enforcement, and a far more serious one in terms of triggering federal interest, is diversion. This will lead us into a third area to really explore within compliance. What systems are in place to prevent diversion? So to recap the compliance piece of due diligence, we have to evaluate three things: the people and their relationships, the papers demonstrating compliance and licensing and adequate logging and record keeping, and now third is the company's protocols and systems. As I mentioned, across the country right now we're seeing wild variations in prices. Prices on the East Coast are much higher than those on the West Coast, where particularly in Oregon, there's a huge oversupply. So growers and dispensaries are losing money, and there's a temptation to divert product back to the black market. So what systems are in place to prevent diversion? On this, you need to look especially at seed-to-sale software tracking and security. If the regulator comes in, they want to be able to look at a plant on the company's system, see where it is in the facility, and then go to that room and find the plant. This seed-to-sale software must work, and employees must know how to use it, and all plants must be captured by it. On the security front, every employee must be searched coming into the facility and coming out of a greenhouse. It sounds obvious, but too often there are little exceptions. An employee says he doesn't want to be searched, or blows by security, or comes in with a backpack that's overlooked. Every plant must be within view of a camera and clearly identifiable on the system. A gap in this system, or plants found outside of a camera area, or an employee not searched, will only invite further scrutiny from regulators who could be suspicious of diversion. Let's move on now to another area where the diligence is unique to cannabis: marketing. We won't spend too much time on this because it's so state-specific, but here are the three major issues to review. Get the full universe of websites, channels, and social media platforms on which the company advertises. Get the full list of any medical or health claims in any advertisements or marketing, and the company's assessment as to how those claims are compliant with state and federal law. Get the policy on how the company ensures that its advertising is not targeted toward or likely to reach minors. Our fourth area of competence, operations, has been covered somewhat by now. We're looking overall at how things are running. Are we efficiently growing and selling? And given that banking is a persistent challenge for the industry, you want a list of banking relationships and proof that the bank is aware of the nature of the business. In addition, you want a description of the company's cash management system and the name of any point-of-sale systems or other sales tracking methods. And speaking of banking, if you are considering banking marijuana business proceeds rather than investing, the due diligence process is simplified. As a bank, you're going to focus your due diligence on compliance, and the documents we suggested collecting and the questions we suggested asking will align nicely with the guidance in the FinCEN memo. The main point is to confirm that the business is operating in full compliance with state law and to file the required suspicious activity report when the account is opened. The banks that have entered this space so far, which have been state-chartered banks and credit unions, have not encountered any federal scrutiny. They have reported subpoenas on certain accounts, but so far we aren't aware of any financial institutions that themselves became subjects of law enforcement investigations for banking marijuana. So as you work through the company's financial competence, its compliance competence, marketing competence, and operations competence, remember that you don't reach the end and then just stop. As long as you maintain the investment or the account, you will need to periodically update your due diligence. This brings us to our final due diligence point. Pay attention to red flags. The three big ones: besides suspicious behavior by managers or employees, a reluctance by the company to answer certain questions, a less than total command of the regulatory environment and recent enforcement actions, and insufficient record keeping. Now let's take a second, simpler example. Let's say you want to lease commercial space to a state legal dispensary. You, of course, will want to start with some of the same considerations: evaluating compliance and proper licensing in particular. The tenant should maintain all of that documentation and make it available to the landlord. But you also want to protect yourself by considering and including in your lease certain provisions that capture the unique risks presented by a dispensary. This is a largely cash business, remember, and unless that cash is removed regularly, you'll be set up for the risk of break-ins and property damage. This is a highly visible business in the community known to have lots of cash. So ensure that the tenant has insurance, has properly disclosed the nature of the business to the insurance company, and has the cash removed daily by a reputable security company. You will want an early termination clause to protect you in the event that there is a nuisance or that there is a change in law that could disrupt the license status and put the landlord at risk of forfeiture or any other interruption in license. For instance, if a school or daycare moves in next door, the license could be lost through no fault of the tenant. And you will want the indemnification clause, which is basically a right to reimbursement if you end up incurring costs as a result of an event triggering early termination. Given the uncertainty and the inconsistency in how different states approach the cannabis industry, remember that there is no such thing as a risk-free venture. So what happens if you do your due diligence, you try to do everything right, and you still find yourself or your company the subject of a criminal investigation? If that happens, don't go it alone. Your initial steps in responding to an investigation are critical, can affect your credibility with the investigators, and shape the outcome of that investigation. Being proactive and having a credible actor on your side is key. And if you have done your due diligence and documented your carefulness, you will be in a much better position to defend against any unexpected scrutiny.